Okay, so how many of us actually enjoy talking about sex?
Yeah.
Even with a partner. It feels like one of those things that everyone jokes about being, like, awkward.
Right.
Like, oh, we should talk more, but, like, nobody actually wants to.
Yeah.
But we're going to deep dive into all that today and hopefully give you some tools to be better at it.
Well, and you know what's so interesting is we got a ton of like source material from you guys on this one.
Yeah.
And it really does feel like this weird thing that's like simultaneously extremely universal, but also very, very difficult.
For sure.
So we're diving into like research articles about how communication and satisfaction are related. We're going into like advice columns. We're even going into like some Reddit threads that you sent.
Yeah, where else do you get information like that,
I know, right? The internet is amazing.
honestly?
But yeah, so we know like communication is key.
Right.
Everyone's always saying that.
Okay, great.
But like what does that even mean?
Yeah, what are you actually supposed to say?
Yeah, this is about going way deeper than that.
Totally.
We're going to unpack not just like what to say, but like how to even have these conversations in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's not like you just wake up one morning and you're like a smooth-talking sex guru.
Right. Right.
Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that came up over and over again, and this is something that I think is like really, really important to start with, is that you have to understand like your own body and your own desires. Like before you even bring a partner into it, like it's about like self-exploration first.
Totally, yeah.
And so much of what we're seeing, especially in the research, is that this is like so crucial for like long-term satisfaction. There was one study that talked about like erotic self-literacy.
What is that? I feel like you're using big words now.
I know, it sounds very like
Yeah.
academic, right? Like very jargony.
Okay.
But it's actually a really empowering concept.
Okay.
So basically, like, it's about approaching, like, your own pleasure and your own, like, sexuality with a sense of curiosity and without judgment.
Okay.
So, like, think of it this way. If sex is, like, a language, right?
Right.
Like, how can you expect to have, like, this eloquent conversation with somebody if you haven't taken the time to, like, learn your own dialect first?
Oh, I like that. That's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
So, okay, but how do you even do that? Like, is this like, are we talking like quizzes here? What are we doing?
I mean, however you want to go about it.
Yeah.
You know, some people really like more structure around this kind of thing.
Okay.
So there are like journaling prompts.
Oh, okay.
We saw a few sources that suggested things like literally just making a list of like, what are the things that make you feel sensual? And not even necessarily like tied to a partner, just like in your own body.
Okay.
Or like even revisiting memories of like past experiences, both like positive and negative, and kind of just like noticing like what worked, what didn't work.
Oh, that's interesting because I feel like we don't do that enough. Yeah. The looking back on the negative. Like we're always so focused on like, oh, this was good. Let's do that again. But it's like, what about all the things that like really didn't work for us?
Totally. And sometimes like those can be the most like illuminating.
Not really.
There was one sex therapist who recommended something called like body mapping.
Okay.
And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like, where you like literally trace your hand on a piece of paper.
I love that. Okay.
And then just kind of spend some time like going through and marking down like, okay, like these are the zones, these are like the sensations I feel. How do those sensations differ, like depending on the touch, depending on pressure, even depending on like my mood that day?
See, I like that because it's tangible. It's like, you talk about these big, like, know yourself. It's like, how do I do that?
Yeah.
But that's like something you could actually
Totally visualize and like work through.
totally.
Okay.
Yeah, it takes it from like this abstract concept to something that's like really concrete.
Totally.
And this is where things get really interesting because remember that article you sent about the male-focused pleasure model?
Yes. Okay, tell me, break that down for me.
Okay, so
Because I've heard that before, but I've never totally understood, like, what does that mean?
so basically it's this idea that like historically both like sex education
Right.
and just like the way that we talk about sex
Mm-hmm.
and the way that sex is portrayed has very much prioritized like the male experience
Yeah.
and particularly like the male orgasm as like the default.
And so, you know, this leads to all of these assumptions about like what's normal, what's desirable that don't necessarily align with like everyone's experience, especially for women.
Oh, 100%.
Right.
Yeah, because it's like if you don't fit in that box, then it's like, well, what's wrong with me?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it can make it so much harder to speak up and be like, actually, like, this is what I want, this is what I need.
Totally.
Because you just assume, like, oh, it's me, like, I'm broken.
Right.
Like, the default must be right, and I'm the one who's, like, messed up.
Totally, yeah.
And so that's, like, a big part of what we're going to be unpacking today is, like, how do we dismantle that model?
Okay.
There was one researcher who described it as, like, learning to read a map that only shows, like, half the territory.
Right.
You know, so by understanding, like, how that bias operates, we can start to, like, challenge those assumptions and actually create space for, like, much more diverse experiences.
Yeah, it's like we can rewrite the map.
Totally.
Okay, but that's just for ourselves.
Right.
Right. So then how do we take it from there to, like, our partners? Because that's a whole other can of worms, I feel like.
Right.
So then how do you actually bring a partner into this?
Right.
Like, how do you start having these conversations if you haven't been?
Yeah, so this is where those, like, smaller conversations can be a really good entry point. You know, remember that Reddit thread you sent about post-sex debriefs?
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
I was like, that sounds equal parts terrifying and hilarious. Like, who wants to be graded on their performance?
I know.
Like, right after.
No, it's definitely not about, like, a point system or anything.
Okay.
But the idea is to kind of create the space for, like, open and honest feedback that's not limited to, like, that was good.
Yeah.
Or even just, like, sticking to compliments, you know?
So how do you make it not like a job review?
Right.
Like, how do you actually make it, like, hot?
It's all about the approach.
Okay.
You know? One therapist we were reading about suggested framing it as, like, what felt amazing and what could feel even more amazing.
Ooh, I like that.
So, like, focusing on, like, sensations and experiences rather than, like, right and wrong.
Like collaborative.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And you know, it can be as simple as saying, like, you know, I loved when you touched me there.
Okay.
Could we do more of that next time? Like, it's about, like, planting these seeds, not presenting, like, a laundry list of demands.
Right. Okay, so then how do you, because that's all, like, positive.
Yeah.
How do you bring up the stuff that, like, maybe you don't want them to do again?
Yeah.
Because that always feels, like, fraught with peril. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely where, like, understanding your partner's communication style comes in.
Okay.
You mentioned that, like, your partner is, like, a little bit more introverted and needs a little bit of time to process information.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Like, I'm someone who processes by talking.
Sure.
He's someone who needs to, like, go think about it.
Totally.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, like, such valuable information to have, you know? Because recognizing those differences can make a huge difference in, like, how you approach those conversations.
Okay.
So, for example, in your case, right?
Yeah.
Like, instead of springing something on him in the heat of the moment,
Right.
which can feel very, like, intense.
Oh, yeah.
It might be helpful to, like, think about, like, okay, how can we, like, schedule a time to talk about this, like, outside of the bedroom?
That makes so much more sense for us. Yeah. Because then it's, like, not when we're, like, trying to also relax. And
Exactly. Exactly. It takes the pressure off of you
Right.
to have to, like, process this big thing.
Yeah.
When you're also trying to, like, connect.
Totally.
And you don't have to have all the answers right away either. Like, sometimes just acknowledging, like, hey, like, this is something I kind of want to talk about. Can we, like, set aside some time in the future?
Oh, so it's like a little, like, you're sending a little invitation, but it's like a sexy invitation.
Totally.
Like a little.
Like, to be continued.
I like that.
And you know, that when you do have those conversations, remember, like, we've been talking about verbal communication a lot, but so much of it is nonverbal too.
Oh, totally.
Like how we're touching, like eye contact.
Right.
The way we're breathing even.
Yeah, it's like they say, like, body language is, speaks louder than words.
For sure.
But it's like, what if your body language is speaking a language you don't understand?
Right.
Like, what if you're not fluent?
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think a good place to start with that is by just, like, paying attention to your own body language.
Okay.
Like, are you holding back physically?
Okay.
Like, is there a disconnect between, like, what you're saying and how you're touching or not touching?
Okay, because I can definitely see, like, for me, I know, like, I'm sometimes, like, a little hesitant to initiate touch.
Sure.
Even if I'm thinking about it.
Right.
So, yeah.
And so much of this is just, like, becoming aware of, like, what are those, like, subtle cues that you're giving yourself even, right? Because that can be, like, really, really powerful.
Okay.
And as you become more attuned to your own, like, nonverbal communication, you naturally will start to pick up on your partner's cues more too.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's like this feedback loop. the more aware you are of yourself.
Yeah.
The more you can kind of tune in to what's going on with them.
Totally.
And nonverbal communication isn't just about like initiating sex or like expressing desire. It's also about communicating boundaries
Right.
and comfort levels.
Oh, for sure.
You know, if something doesn't feel good, like your body will often tell you
Yeah.
and your partner
Totally.
long before your words will.
Right, for sure. So, okay, that's helpful for like the in the moment stuff.
Mm.
But what about the times where like you do kind of have to use your words?
Right.
Like how do you actually like bring up like a fantasy or like a desire that feels super vulnerable?
Yeah,
Even if you like you've done all this work to feel comfortable, like it still feels scary to say it out loud.
totally.
And that's where like I guess all this work we're talking about, like knowing yourself comes in.
Totally. Totally. The more comfortable you are, like exploring those desires internally,
Right.
the less daunting it feels to actually like share them with somebody else.
Okay.
One technique that we saw, like a few sources recommend, is something called like the sandwich approach, which sounds very technical.
Okay, like a compliment sandwich for your fantasies.
Basically, yeah, like it's about framing a request
Okay.
or like a desire that feels like potentially vulnerable
Right.
between two things that are like really positive.
Okay.
So like instead of just blurting out like, "Hey, I've always wanted to try insert fantasy here."
Right, which can feel very abrupt.
Which can feel very abrupt and like put like a lot of pressure on the moment, right? You know, it's like you start by saying something that you genuinely appreciate about like their intimacy style or something that you like really, really enjoy, and then like you segue into the request and then you end on like another positive note.
Oh, that's so smart. So it's like you're reminding each other like this is good,
Totally.
but also like maybe we could add this.
Exactly. It's like creating that container
Yeah.
of like safety and positivity
Oh,
so that like that one request doesn't feel so scary.
right. Okay. And you know, speaking of scary, like sometimes even with the best communication, like these conversations bring up weird stuff.
Oh, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
You know, like you can have all the skills in the world and then suddenly you're like feeling insecure or you're like not sure what to say.
Totally.
So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think one of the most valuable things you can do in those moments is to just like acknowledge the discomfort.
Okay.
You know, remember like that research you sent in about how couples who avoid conflict actually end up like less satisfied over time.
Right.
Like the same principle applies to sexual communication.
Oh, interesting. So it's like, even if it feels a little awkward, it's better to like at least name it.
Totally. Totally. Like trying to pretend everything is fine when it's not, like that will backfire eventually.
Okay.
And it's so important to just like create space for those like messier emotions. You know, like the awkwardness, the vulnerability, even like a little bit of frustration or
Right.
like whatever comes up for
In
you.
fact, real too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all part of it.
Okay. I like that. So it's not about like getting to some perfect way of talking about sex. It's just like
Totally.
being real about like where you're at.
100%.
Okay.
You know, it's about showing up authentically, being willing to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
and just kind of embracing like the messy, imperfect beauty of like human connection.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's such a good note to end on, actually.
Hmm.
So I think with that, we're gonna wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
A huge thank you to you for coming on the show and talking about all this stuff with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, what was that last thought you always have, like a good provocative thought for us?
Well, I would just say, you know, like remember, communication is a journey. It's not a destination.
Ooh, okay.
You know, embrace the stumbles, celebrate the victories.
Yeah.
And most importantly, like just keep those conversations going.
Love that. Such good advice. And yeah, that's it for this week's deep dive on all things sexual communication. Until next time.